Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. Vice President M. Venkaiah Naidu on Monday said that India, which represents 1/6 of the global population, has a rightful claim to the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council. One of the key historic reasons for India's quest for a permanent seat at the UNSC was to ensure protection of national interests in crucial diplomatic moments when the organ takes up issues such as Kashmir. Delivering a joint G4 statement on behalf of Brazil, Germany, India and Japan, India's permanent representative Syed Akbaruddin in 2016 stated that the grouping was eager for a forward discussion on UNSC permanent membership and reforms. Diplomats have blamed China for having quietly carried out a campaign to stop India's efforts at the UNSC. Veteran diplomats have said that the latest UNSC meeting on Kashmir, which was convened following an initiative from China, showed that India will have to show more stamina to stop China from using the organ against India's interest. The issue of expanding the UNSC and the text-based negotiation is expected to be taken up yet again in September when the UNGA session takes place. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze UNSC reforms and a permanent seat for India. Joining me on the program today are Harshvi Pant, Head Strategic Studies, Observer Research Foundation; Pramit Pal Chowdhury, Foreign Editor of the Hindustan Times; and Anil Trigunayat, former Ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. What are your thoughts on India being a permanent member of the UNSC?
Well, we should have been a permanent member quite some time back. And India deserves, and what the Vice President said is 1/6 of the world population. And it is not only the population. India has been a founder member of the United Nations. And we have been always respecting the institutions, participating in the institutions, and always supporting the United Nations as an institution, so that it just doesn't remain a talk shop as some countries do it. But at the same time, we know that it is not an easy job in every country. Each of the countries that are aiming to become part of the high table have certain countries that are opposing them. India is opposed by China and Pakistan. Germany is opposed by UK and France. And Brazil is opposed by Argentina. And like that, you know, there are all the four countries which are the key members. Then the African countries, they haven't come up with their candidates, two candidates. So there have been a lot of discussions going on. But personally, I feel that India has to continue to make the efforts. And there is a broad consensus that India needs to be there. Japan needs to be there because they are funding the United Nations quite a bit, substantially. But at the same time...
Not just funding, India sends several troops
India,
as well.
I'm talking about Japan,
yes.
Essentially. But India, of course, in the peacekeeping, India has been a leader in the peacekeeping operations and again upholding the UN principles and credentials there. But what happens is India is also a major, big economic emerging power. Now, India has generally followed an independent foreign policy that very often is not seen by those powers who are sitting, those five members, in sync with us, what we want, and some because we independently behave sometimes. Whether it was the bombing of Libya in the recent past, I mean, we opposed it in the first place and then finally abstained on the vote. So they know it whenever India is there. India has a voice, India has a following. But today, if you come to see, India's clout in the United Nations has increased substantially. Whether it was the election of the Indian International Court of Justice, where the British candidate was for the first time, there is no British judge on the ICJ. Or for that matter, it was International Day of Yoga, which was 177 countries, the first time, and several Muslim countries have done that. So wherever we have tried to take a lead, we have succeeded in the recent past. And India is trying to provide that kind of a lead. And I hope that a critical mass will eventually occur. But let's not be in any doubt that none of the P5 countries, France has recently said that it is a strategic need that India should be at the high table. But at the same time, whether it's US, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, all of them have their own angularities.
Absolutely.
When it comes to expanding the Security Council. Other reforms may perhaps succeed earlier.
Right. So they wanted to continue to be an exclusive club of just five. All right. Pramit Pal Chowdhury, so India is not alone, like the ambassador just pointed out. There are three other countries as well. Brazil is one of them, Germany and Japan, who want a permanent seat at this particular table. Are the claims made by these four countries justified? Do they deserve a seat at the table?
Well, the thing is that over time, when the original G4, group of four nations, as you mentioned, was created in the mid-2000s and the campaign began, by the end of the first round of campaigning over about 3 years, India realized, and I remember the then Foreign Secretary actually was briefing us on this. He said that we began with the belief that India was actually the weakest of the four candidates in terms of its support. By the end of the campaign, we realized actually India was the strongest candidate. The problem is that the candidacy for both Germany and Japan has actually declined since then. In Japan's case, they have a basic problem that both their economic clout is declining, and China's opposition to Japan is now almost fanatical. I mean, China has basically said that if there's one country we will never allow into the Security Council, it is Japan. And in fact, in private, Chinese diplomats have actually urged India, leave the G4 and perhaps then we can consider supporting you. But as long as you're part of the G4, we cannot support Japan. Germany, as is mentioned, Spain and Italy in particular have taken great objection to Germany's inclusion. And Germany's economic clout has also been declining within Europe. There's a lot of opposition in Africa and Latin America and Arab world to an additional European power. They said that why should Europe of all continents have now 3 Security Council permanent seats? That makes no sense. And at one point, which was true in the mid-2000s, there was talk of a combined European Union seat. But now with Brexit, that's obviously dead. Britain will not surrender its seat because it is one of its few remaining sources of international prestige. So in that case, France would have to merge its seat with Germany, which France is unwilling to do as well. So the European case, therefore, is very difficult to sell overseas. Brazil remains obviously an obvious candidate, though they have strong opposition from both Argentina and Mexico. Mexico's argument that their GDP is actually almost the same size as Brazil's, therefore they should be eligible. And finally, as the ambassador mentioned, Africa has yet to make a call. Africa it should have been a G5 group, but we had asked the Africans to choose a candidate among themselves. We had dabbled with South Africa, which is economically the most powerful African country, but Nigeria is by far the largest. I mean, if you make the argument that India's population is the basis for candidacy, then Nigeria is overwhelmingly the African candidate. But Africa is deeply divided on this issue because Egypt is another country that believes that it should be representing the African continent. So therefore, Africa has gone absolutely nowhere in being able to come to an internal decision about who should represent them. And that remains one of the biggest stumbling blocks to any forward movement on this, because everybody always comes back to but who is Africa going to choose? And the answer is 0. We don't know.
Sure. So that having been said, Harshdeep Pant, let's now look at the permanent members of the UNSC and where they stand. Before we get to China, of course, let's look at some of the other countries, that is the US, UK, France, and so on and so forth. So what is their stand? Do they want to expand the UNSC? Do they want more people? Do they want to be more accommodative? Or where do these countries stand?
Well, I think, international institutions reflect the balance of power when they are created. So clearly this is a balance of power reflective of 1945. But the reality of that institutional structure is such that you have to rely on the status quo powers to actually change the status quo. So they are not going to change the status quo because it will underwrite in some ways the reality that we are all witnessing. We are witnessing the decline of the West in relative terms. And if you look at the 3 main powers there, sitting there, UK, France and America, they are not going to cede that because that will simply confirm that the West is on a decline. And I think that is where the problem is stuck, that while they can pick and choose, diplomatically to, for example, at times when you have visitors coming to India from some of these countries, they say, well, we support India's case for a permanent membership. But what does it mean in operational terms? What are they willing to do to support India's case? Are they willing to mobilize global public opinion in India's favor? No, India will have to do that on its own. And therefore, the question is whether you have the 3 or 4 or 5 members on the Security Council on whose veto would depend the future structure of that organization. Are they willing to abide by the original premise of the UN Charter, which somehow they argue is written in ways that is both idealistic and realistic. It's realistic because it gave power to the 5 powers, without whom United Nations would not have succeeded or would not even have functioned if they were not part of that power structure. So clearly now we are at an inflection point where the global power hierarchies are changing, and therefore there is an expectation that those who are on the decline would give up. But we know if you know our history correctly, we know that losing sides or losing powers or declining powers don't give up that easily. So how do you manage this transition? And I think that's where the debate is stuck. There is again process has become more important than the reality.
Absolutely.
So we keep on talking about how many times this issue has been discussed and what kind of procedures are involved within the UN system, how many committees have recommended, how many times that it should be reformed. But I think this would be the most difficult part of the reform agenda. UN has reformed over the last few years, but this will remain a reform which I think will belie us for some time at least.
Okay, all right. Taking the discussion forward now, let's look at China's role, Ambassador, and how China has been scuttling India's efforts at the UNSC.
Well, China has very clearly, in its own perception, has equated India with Pakistan. Pakistan is its tool, and it prevents anything against Pakistan that happens. I have sat through several meetings and I have found that they have very overt and very clear support of Pakistan, like an iron friend or whatever they call it. But at the same time, the most recent incident was when China, at the behest or besiegement of Pakistan, called for the informal consultations. And that shows the need that if you are not in the room, you keep getting bashed. I mean, that despite the fact that you have all the friends, but everybody eventually comes to know that, okay, India has again been equated to Pakistan in this, which is what we should always avoid being there. That Pakistan is able to pull us down to their level. That's what I say. Now, China takes that stand and it tries to keep it as if it is going to create some kind of a problem. And in the United Nations, it has the vote, so you cannot go against it. It will always stop it. So for India, it is extremely important that it builds its constituency. I mean, in the UNGA generally, we have a very good set of people, and which was also clearly evident. There are at least 12 or 13 members of the current UNSC either did not react negatively to India or positively supported India. France, of course, is an avid supporter of India overtly. The Americans sometimes say that the biggest country with biggest population should be there, or the Brazil they might mean in some place, or they might mean Japan. They obviously support. China does not support either Japan or India. So their phraseology which they use is very interesting, which the Chinese use. They would not say we don't support India. Similarly, the Russians, when they come to supporting, they say yes, we want India to be there. But then the process, as Mr. Pant said, the process is what is very important. So once you get going in the process, the takeaway point is that at the end of the day, none of them want to expand the table.
Sure.
That's precisely the case. They want everybody to get entangled into these webs. And don't want. In fact, India was also in favor of continuing for, let's say, about 10 years or so without the veto, be a part of the UNSC and see how it behaves. That would have been a starting point. But that again, there are many problems within this, with the groups, different groups. L77 coming on the text-based negotiations, then somebody won't agree. Like, for example, out of the 122 countries who have given their comments on the negotiations or the text, 113 support the reforms.
Absolutely.
including that of the UNSC.
Sure.
So we need to continue to work on it, but it is going to be a little bit of a long haul.
Yeah, it's going to be a long process, but we need to continue to keep chipping away at that and, trying to do our best. All right. So, Pramit, as far as this whole China issue is concerned and looking at what China has done in the recent past, especially calling for this closed door meeting, of the UNSC as far as Kashmir is concerned, is it now time for India to look beyond the Wuhan warmth and start giving it back to China?
Say the Wuhan warmth was always understood to be effectively a temporary truce. It's not that Wuhan was very clear. In fact, by calling it an informal summit, it was understood that India and China would not really address any of the differences and problems that faced them, including the question of the Dalai Lama succession, the border disputes, or even the issue of Pakistan or anything else. So Wuhan was effectively China and India agreeing that after the Doklam crisis, they would agree to lower the temperature of a relationship that was deteriorating rather rapidly. And that was all it was, because for India, given that we were going into elections, we were happy to not have to worry about our northern border. And for Xi Jinping, because he was then in the beginnings of what is still continuing to be a very nasty trade war with the United States, he didn't want to have his southern flank, if you wish, open up in front of him. And you'll notice that Xi Jinping did exactly the same thing with Japan at the same time. He then basically went to Japan and said, please, temporary, I'm not settling Senkaku Island dispute, but I want to lower the temperature. He allowed Shinzo Abe for the first time to have a summit meeting on Chinese soil, and so on. So the Wuhan spirit was never about the two countries getting along. It was just about the two countries agreeing not to get into each other's hair. That will continue, in my view, partly because we in India have other problems on our hands that we still wish to focus on. Kashmir, with now a new massive shift in our policy, we have certain economic concerns that we need to settle. China has still the same problems. They still have now they're worried about their economy. They still have a problem with the United States. So they're not interested in getting into anything. But keep in mind that even during the spirit of Wuhan, we effectively had a proxy war, not proxy war, but a proxy struggle in the Maldives and in Sri Lanka,
right,
and in other places where effectively we tried to overthrow each other's governments there on the basis of who they were aligning with, and there were a number of other, sort of say, lesser known struggles between India and China. So the relationship is not particularly strong, and so obviously something like UNSC is on a completely different level of trust and convergence, which simply doesn't exist.
Right.
What I think is interesting right now when it comes to Pakistan, Pakistan's GDP in dollar terms now is less than the city of Mumbai. Okay, this is a country that's 1/10 of our GDP and falling further and further behind. China is now finding it increasingly difficult to keep bailing this country out, because it's like a black hole. You put in $10 billion, it just disappear, and they're right back to square one 12 months later. And it was interesting that it was the Chinese who told the Pakistanis, you have to go to the IMF and take the hard medicine that IMF is going to force on you, because we just can't keep paying for your country.
Right.
So the Chinese now keep talking, when they come to about Pakistan, it's partly, yes, this is our all-weather friend, and therefore we have to support them. But it's also, can you please have a dialogue with Pakistan, give them a break. So, a very unusually Xi Jinping, when they met in the last summit, Xi Jinping actually went off the agenda and said, why don't you consider a dialogue with Pakistan? Even though he knew that Modi would have to say no.
Right.
But he still tried to make that plea, very unusually for a Chinese leader. And it continues to be something they keep asking privately, why don't you consider something, anything, with Pakistan, just to take it easy on these poor fellows.
Just to take the heat off, basically.
Take the heat off of them, yes.
Yeah, all right. So Harshvi Pant, how do we deal with China's efforts to continuously try and rake up issues after issue at the UNSC?
Well, I think, we have to somehow, especially after what has happened in Kashmir recently, we should expect that this would happen. We should, we should expect that this will continue for a while, because after all, this is this issue lies at the very soul of Pakistan's identity. So if Pakistan will make a hue and cry, and Pakistan will expect its friends to take its, to support its cause in the UN Security Council. But I think the realization that China is more or less isolated in the UN Security Council is something that if you keep on doing that again and again to China, they come to a conclusion that they can only do so much. Remember, Hafiz Saeed happened after a while. Lots of times they continued to block India's case. Eventually, they realized that they are so isolated that they have to give in. So I think at some, a time will come when perhaps this would also happen. But as I think Pramit mentioned interestingly, that how can China continue to equate India and Pakistan in a context that's so radically altering and so rapidly altering in front of your eyes, that if you need to retain diplomatic agility, you need to find ways of finding some traction with India. And that's where I think we look for Xi's visit to India in October, which would again be a continuation of the so-called Wuhan spirit, and whatever happens there would also have a bearing on future conversations. But I think it would be an important conversation to have, just to know where they stand today, because we have seen a shift. We are looking at that shift, and the shift is happening because Pakistan is on the verge of an economic collapse. The shift is also happening because China is feeling the pinch of the economic conflict that it is facing from the US. So there are lots of things happening within China. There are lots of things happening as far as Sino-Pak relationship is concerned. But I think on Kashmir in particular, this issue will continue to resonate with Pakistan because of its identity, and it will continue therefore to resonate to a certain degree with China. And therefore some amount of back and forth on this question is to be expected. But the silver lining is that now if they see the kind of isolation, 13, 14 members supporting India's case, or at least not siding on China on this, or not allowing a statement to come out, I think that's a massive signal that the issue as such does not have much traction within the larger international community.
Sure.
So perhaps China can look at it differently. China can start putting pressure on Pakistan itself, and we have seen a nuanced statement coming out from China on this question itself, where they are more concerned about Ladakh, they are not concerned about Kashmir. So I think they are now looking at it more in geopolitical terms, more in the sense of how do you take the conversation with India forward, because if Kashmir becomes a defining issue, then they also realize that the conversation from Indian side will stop. So I think they want that conversation to continue, and perhaps there are avenues there that India can use and leverage.
All right. Closing comments now from all my guests with the best way forward as far as a permanent seat at the UNSC is concerned. Ambassador, what can we expect from France? France has emerged as a very close ally in recent times. What's likely to happen there?
Well, France is supporting openly as far as India's candidature is concerned. Some others have, like Russia has said in bilateral dialogues and all, but at the end of the day, when it comes to the United Nations Security Council discussions and reforms, they always say the process has to be done, it has to go through the system, and they all know that the process is very long rather. China will continue to oppose India and probably will be the last one to agree in the end. The Americans play up different games. I mean, they would also know, and I think in the background, even though they admit that India could be there, but they would like India to be the right side of them, sure, rather than having independent. And I believe that a time will come when India will be there on the table, but I don't see an immediate possibility of things moving forward the way we would like it to go.
Absolutely. And Pramit, what can we expect from the Trump administration as far as this, as far as India and the UNSC are concerned?
See, the point with Republican administrations in general, why they don't necessarily have any problems with India becoming a permanent member. Republicans, by definition, are hostile to the United Nations as a whole. They are simply not interested in the United Nations as an organization. So they're not prepared to invest any capital or do anything with the UN one way or the other. So it's almost a waste of time to try to get a Trump who thinks the United Nations is just a wasted piece of real estate in Manhattan, to expect him to come out and fight on your behalf. Which is why it's probably more useful to get the Republicans to fight, a Republican administration to fight for something like the Nuclear Suppliers Group or another multilateral agency in which they can see tangible reasons why India has to be part of. It's
Right.
generally the Democrats who are more interested in the larger idea that the multilateral structure should reflect actual existing power. But I'll just say, you know, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, one time when we were flying with him, we asked him about the UN Security Council seat. He wasn't overly concerned about this. He didn't see this as a priority. He just said, if we can make our economy grow at 10% for 10 years, they will ask us to be a permanent member. So let's focus on that first.
Okay, all right. And Harshvi Pant, close the show for us with your concluding remarks, because let's not forget the UNGA session is to take place in September. Can we expect the issue of UNSC reforms and expansion coming up there?
I think like every year it will come up again, and I think those countries that have a direct stake in this conversation will take it forward. But I don't think this issue is generating that kind of energy today that it used to generate a decade or so back, because countries have gone through the motions and they've realized that it's going to be much more complicated and much more treacherous than they had expected. But I think the point which India should concentrate on is that while we need to spend diplomatic capital on this question, we shouldn't be over-investing on this, because at the end of the day, if you are economically, as Pramit pointed out, militarily and diplomatically important enough that you are part of every single important global conversation, then you somehow alleviate many of these problems. So clearly our intent should be that we should be part of all of these major conversations, and we clearly are today by sheer heft of our weight. Economic, political and military, we are part of most of these conversations, and therefore international communities, the way it looks at India today is dramatically different from what it used to be a decade or so back. If these trends continue, then I think the reality of the fact of the matter is that India would be part of the P6, irrespective of whether it is part of the P5 or not.
All right then. On that note, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it on this edition of The Big Picture. See you again next time.